I think it's pretty fair to say that Kathleen Kennedy is probably one of the most hated people on the internet, at least in some circles. If you talk to Star Wars fans, especially on YouTube, she is the one that is credited with all of the series' current woes. And to be fair, that criticism is extremely justified because we have many, many, many forms of examples of this. And I've covered them before in previous videos, like there was never a plan for Star Wars because, as we're going to see in this particular interview, yeah, there was never a plan. Also, that there was a rumor that she was out at Lucasfilm. This was something that was big, that was crazy. And of course, it didn't happen. She re-upped for 3 years. But still, big news at the time, and it made waves. And of course, this is just my personal thumbnail that I made. I kind of forget the exact video this was, but I just like it, so I wanted to share. But Kathleen Kennedy is a person who, no matter how much you want to push against her for Lucasfilm and its current situation, she has over 40 years of experience in the industry. She is a well-known player, and she does know quite a bit. So in that regard, I give her the credit she deserves, but I still think she has made a mess of things at Star Wars and definitely needs to fix it, if that can even happen, which who knows. But here was this article that popped up today, this interview in Rolling Stone from Brian Hyatt, who says Lucasfilm's Kathleen Kennedy on the Rise of Skywalker and the future of Star Wars. In a digital exclusive from our upcoming Star Wars cover package, Lucasfilm President Kathleen Kennedy discusses the challenges of moving the franchise forward, George Lucas's criticism, and much more. So this article starts off with the typical fanfare, how long she's been in the industry, all those things, but then it gets into some interesting stuff. First up is Colin Trevorrow, addressing a little bit about his exit, and in some aspects, and this is just my personal take, throwing him under the bus. Now let's read here. So the question is, Jurassic World director Colin Trevorrow was slated to write and direct episode 9 before you brought JJ back in. Is this final entry in the trilogy particularly hard nut to crack? And she says, every one of these movies is a particularly hard nut to crack. There's no source material. We don't have comic books. We don't have 800-page novels. We don't have anything other than passionate storytellers to get together and talk about what the next iteration might be. And I believe many of you out there watching right now are going to go, that's an outright lie. You've got the entirety of the EU, never mind the new canon that they have made. You have Star Wars Legends and you have the new canon. So there is a lot to pull from, especially the EU, which quite frankly is what fans want. Now, she goes on to say, I would also argue that sometimes people get involved in the normal development process and they realize, oh my God, this is so much more than I ever imagined. So it's pretty common that when you're working on movies, you're not making choices and decisions that necessarily work out exactly the way that you want from the get-go. To me, that's a direct dig at Colin Trevorrow. That is kind of throwing him under the bus, saying he couldn't handle it, is basically what she's trying to say. But finishing up here, this quote, she says, so I feel pretty fortunate that I've worked with so many great people that have absolutely committed, JJ being one of them. He's a huge fan, incredibly passionate about Star Wars, and has been from the moment he and I sat down and started talking about this. And the more he got involved, the more excited he became. So I think if you asked him today, he'd probably wishes he was in a situation where he could have done all three. But as I said, these are huge projects, so it's very difficult. Unless there are 3 or 4 years in between, it's not really or physically possible. So she tosses Trevorrow under a bus while propping up JJ. That, I believe, is pretty damn accurate. And I would love to get Trevorrow's ultimate story for what went down. And maybe one day down the road, when Kennedy's out of Lucasfilm, we might get the truth. But if you also really pay attention there, she admits they had no plan. She goes, if you ask JJ Abrams here whether or not he wishes he could have done all 3, he probably would say yes, because he had outlined all 3 and Johnson tossed a lot of it in the dustbin. We don't know exactly to what extent. And again, something that I hope down the road we will figure out. We will find out that information, but I believe it's abundantly clear. Now, going on, she talks more about JJ and Chris Terrio bringing him in to write it. So the question is, what strikes you about how he and his co-screenwriter Chris Terrio managed to crack the nut for this one, saying Chris is a very thoughtful, intelligent guy that JJ chose and we all got to know. And again, it went through much of what we often go through, which is endless discussion, lots of artwork. Luckily, JJ had already been in a pretty deep dive before he was doing The Force Awakens and during the process of that movie. It's almost like an education of getting antiquated with all aspects of Star Wars, not only just looking at movies, but talking to the number of people who are still around that worked with George for years, understanding the mythology that he created. One of the things we talk about all the time is the fact that it was very important that to George, that these stories really meant something, that they have something to say, that they have a real emotional core. And that is, if you go and watch the Force Awakens, what they were building up to. I don't know where things went wrong in The Last Jedi. Rian Johnson comes across as an emotionally broken person in my mind, so that could be a potential issue there. But she goes on to say, as I said, with something where you don't necessarily have any source material, again, that's false. She knows that's false because JJ outlined everything. Okay, I'm getting off topic. Then you're looking for a filmmaker who has a strong point of view, who can find themselves in the characters in the story. That's what drives the momentum of storytelling. And I think JJ is a perfect example of that. He can't do anything without his energy and enthusiasm becoming very much part of the storytelling. So he's very fun to be in a room with when you're trying to break a story, because he does have an amazing energy and enthusiasm, and he's funny, and that always helps. We spend a lot of time laughing. So I think really when I read that passage, she is clearly propping him up because she needs him, for one. And two, I do think that there was a bit of regret of not bringing him in to do all three, not signing him to do all three. There's a lament of regret there because, look, and this is just my speculation, her legacy depends on this movie and this franchise doing well. Despite her 40 years experience in the industry and the fact that she's had fingers in all of our childhoods, this is something that she absolutely positively needs to have work well. Anyway, this part is what I think the fandom menace is really going to latch onto. If I'm being honest with you, this is not a criticism of the fandom menace. I'm merely saying this is what I think. If anything gets pulled from this article, this is what you're going to see the most being talked about. So, it says here, how did you get to a point where you felt we've got this with the story of episode 9? Because there's been a lot of stuff about that. She says, well, I wouldn't say you ever get to a point where you just go, that's it. It's a constantly evolving process. I mean, there's still little things that we're trying to get exactly right now. You never stop the storytelling iterations that go on in making these movies, but we know that these previous 8 movies are. We know what the story is. So in this movie, we're taking all of what's come before and we're trying to find a satisfying conclusion. And I think we have. And that's something that we can only depend on our instincts to arrive at, whether or not we have. And then with what we have, I would call the family and friends that you pull in and show things to when you're trying to get some kind of feedback and make sure that you're making sense and that you're delivering on the things you intend. That's something that we're still talking about right now. So I think in that particular regard, what she's referring to is just like they had no real plan. Like they didn't have one going into this. Even JJ bringing in Chris Terrio was like, we gotta make it work. And they're still trying to refine the process. Now, a lot of people in the fandom menace have talked about the idea that it's a disaster, that it's a total train wreck. And I have said, and this is just my speculation to their speculation, is that it's always an evolving process. The movies are built in the edit bay. You plan it, you shoot it, you might not get what you need, or it might not be exactly what you want, your vision, so you go back and you fix it. It's always an evolving storytelling process. A novelist wouldn't release the first draft of their novel. That's part of it. So when she also says here about calling in family and friends, that's the only people that are going to be seeing this movie, or any bits of this movie, are people that they know, that they trust, and aren't going to leak it, which is why test screenings, what we're hearing about test screenings, I'm just going to say are false. Now, this is where she gets to the part talking about Rian Johnson a bit more. And again, there's a bit of defense, and I understand that. But at the same time, just let's take a look. So it says here, Rian Johnson made some controversial choices in episode 8, The Last Jedi, especially considering its dramatic purpose as a second movie in the trilogy. Were you, to an extent, deliberately setting out to challenge fans and their expectations? Which is a loaded question, but her answer, oh my God. She's like, we definitely did. Terrible thing to say right off the bat. We're talking about all the time how we move Star Wars forward and how we keep it relevant. Obviously, we don't want to keep making the same movie over and over again, so I agree with you. I mean, I love what Rian did. It's an absolutely wonderful movie, and I think he's an extraordinary filmmaker, and I really appreciated the bold moves that he did make. I think people forget that, especially when you're doing a trilogy structure, the first movie is setting things up, the second is usually the conflict, and the third is the resolution. So if you're bound to have that second movie, much the same way Empire Strikes Back was probably the darkest and most dramatic of the three, we talked about it with Indiana Jones. You know, we did Raiders, and then we did Temple of Doom, which was dark and created a lot of controversy, and people were surprised at where it went with the storytelling, but frankly, that's the whole point. And I'm not happy that she invoked this trilogy, right? The best trilogy outside of Star Wars is the Indiana Jones trilogy. Because, you know, Temple was a prequel, so it's not tied to a trilogy. Empire is tied to a trilogy. It's the second act in a trilogy. Raiders takes place 1936. Temple takes place 1935. It's a prequel. So Raiders would be considered the middle story in that trilogy if you want to look at it from that perspective. So her analogy there doesn't make any sense. And yes, Temple was definitely controversial. We have that movie to thank for the PG-13 rating that I think has plagued a lot of movies for the majority of time that it's been around. But also trying to use that as a deflection for Rian Johnson and challenging and subverting expectations is a very weak argument to make because of the narrative structure of that movie and how it played out. And I do think that that is very much a deflection, and trying to turn it onto Indiana Jones as a way to bring up nostalgia. I just, no. I will always push back on that because that is not how it gets done. Anyway, she goes on to say here, all right, it says, certainly whatever movie comes after this is, if it's unconnected to the Skywalker Saga, it's one of the biggest challenges in the history of the franchise. Until now, pretty much everything has been in some ways connected. What are your thoughts on that? She says, it's an incredible challenge, and it's something that we're in the middle of, and I can't even begin to tell you where this may end up, because I think you're absolutely right. I think whatever the next movie is and how it begins to define a new way forward, something we want to take plenty of time and plenty of conversation and careful thought before deciding exactly what we're going to do. So what does that mean? That means a plan, which she's admitted she didn't have before. She admits there was never a plan, and earlier in the article, and then this time she's like, we're now trying to get a plan. So that's good. Now he goes on to say, so you truly haven't decided what's next. She says, no, we've got various things we're looking at in various ways which we can begin or not, as you can imagine. You know, do you go back? Do you go forward? All those questions are being asked. Do we stay in this galaxy? Do we go for another? The universe is never ending. This is good news and the bad news. They have endless possibilities. It's liberating, it's exciting, and it creates a lot of pressure and anxiety as well. Which, you know, I get it, because she's basically at this point asking the question, what's my place in all this? Where are we going to go next? What's going to happen next? And I would argue that, again, the EU is there. It's waiting. It's waiting. Fans want it. This is what fans want. You know, when Kevin Feige says, oh, we're going to be doing this character in a Marvel movie, and everyone's like, oh, is it going to be that storyline? I hope it's that storyline. That storyline is great. And then they do that storyline and people get really happy. You know, people get super happy when there's a good storyline that they're familiar with. Even if it's the EU, you can still tie it in. Disney Plus is going to be where a lot of that takes place. But right now, yeah, no, they're all asking, what's my place in all this? Because they don't know, and they're panicking because they have come to the end of the game, and everything, the sand is all, you know, the ground's falling out from underneath them, and they got to bring it home, which I do think they will. But at the same time, where they go in the future, that is Kennedy's legacy, right? It's like, that is a big part of it. And so not knowing what's going on and trying to really get to it is, who knows? Anyway, this is where Feige comes into the picture, right? She addresses the Feige situation, and it's one that, again, I think it's you know, it's Hollywood, you know, president speak, but there's a lot there I think we can take from it. So it says here, how did Marvel's Kevin Feige come into the mix? She says, Kevin has been a huge fan of Star Wars, and he's made that pretty clear. And I think he went off to do a couple Spider-Man movies and realized he could kind of step in and out of what he's doing specifically with just Marvel. He talked to us and he talked to the studio and said, you know, is there any chance I could get in and get one of these Star Wars movies? And I thought it'd be a pretty cool idea. So we're just beginning to talk about what that might be and when that might be, but it's a ways off. Let's be fair. Let's be realistic. Let's cut the BS for a second. It's not a ways off. It's coming soon, right? With the Game of Thrones guys having walked away, that leaves it perfectly open for Kevin Feige to step in. It gives him 3 years to develop a movie and get it into cinemas. And Feige can crank out 4 movies a year and TV shows and everything else he's going to be working on. I think they can do it. Is it just going to be one movie? No, this is going to be the reformation of where Star Wars is going is with Feige. They don't have a plan. She's already admitted. They're working on a plan. She just admitted. Feige wants to come in and shake it up a little bit. And you know what? It's going to be successful. So people who want it, which is everybody who knows about it wants it, they're going to want to see what Feige pulls in next. That's all I'm saying. Anyway, now we get to the final part of it where they talk about George Lucas. And this probably could have been a video all into itself, but I wanted just to have it be part of this discussion. So when asked here, is there any universe in which George can be lured back for some kind of one-off just to do anything? And she says, I doubt it. But listen, I think that idea would be fantastic if you were interested in doing that again, but I doubt it. He's loving his museum, the Los Angeles Lucas Museum of Narrative Art right now. That's a huge project, which is going to be absolutely fantastic. It's a narrative museum, so it really keeps him engaged in storytelling, and he's loving that, and he's loving his 6-year-old daughter, Everest, so he's pretty fulfilled. And I think I think, yeah, when it comes to Lucas, I think he's done. I just think he's done. And I know he's kind of like talked to people and he's done a little bit, went to the Mandalorian set and everything else. But I think for the most part, he is done. And that's unfortunate, but okay, right? Everyone eventually steps away. The dude's in his 70s. I get it. But Kathleen Kennedy here clearly is I think done after this movie. There's no movie coming out before the end of her next step, before the end of her contract. Once Iger's gone, she's not going to have any of that protection. And I think after all these years of doing it and the controversy from The Last Jedi and the fallout from Solo and everything else, she's ready to move on with her life to get back to doing what she's doing, which is producing and not running a studio. And that's where I think things are. So I'm very happy that this Rolling Stone article exists because it does give us a look into her mindset, a look into her managerial style. And also it showed us, I believe, without a shadow of a doubt, that they never had a plan going in to this sequel trilogy, that they were going to kind of do it by the seat of their pants, start the first one, see where it goes, when they realized that Johnson completely derailed the entire franchise and Colin Trevorrow couldn't crack that nut, right? Couldn't crack it, apparently. They went back to JJ, and JJ already had an outline. He already had a plan, and then they're just going to wrap up the storyline that JJ had started. And it goes to show you that there was so much mismanagement here that even though the movie opens in a month from today, there's a lot riding on it. There's so much more riding on it for Kathy than literally anybody else out there. And so anyway, I leave it to you, your thoughts, your opinions. Let me know down in the comments below if you made it this far. Please type Star Wars into the chat so I know. And if you like these longer form videos, let me know that as well. Please subscribe and all that good, happy, fun stuff. Have yourself a great day. May the Force be with you, and peace out. This video is supported by patrons like you. If you'd like to become a patron, please head over to patreon.com/Matt Jarbo.